Thank you for this opportunity to share some of my thoughts about ESG, the role of finance in addressing the critical issues of sustainable growth, in particular in the context of the climate crisis. There have been a marked change in perspective since Milton Friedman wrote his famous article on what the objective of firms should be just over 50 years ago. Milton Friedman argued that firms should focus on just one objective, and that was maximizing shareholder value. Ironically, as he was writing, I was engaged in a research program addressing the question of what should be the objective of firms. What kind of maximization should firms engage in if societal well-being were to be maximized? And the fruits of that research, written with my colleague Sandy Grossman, were published a few years later in the Journal of Finance and the Quarterly Journal of Economics. And we showed unambiguously that shareholder value maximization did not lead to societal well-being. Unfortunately, Milton Friedman publishing in the New York Times had more influence than Sandy Grossman and I publishing in the Journal of Finance and the Quarterly Journal of Economics. Milton Friedman was a great polemicist. He put his arguments very forcefully, even if the underlying economics was bogus, even if there was no theory underlying his contention. Since then, there has been growing discontent with the perspective that Friedman put forward, that firms should simply maximize shareholder value. This issue of thinking about how to design an economic system where we incorporate broader sets of objectives into the firm, the ESG agenda, is not just a matter of theoretical nicety. It's an imperative if we are going to have a successful, sustainable economic, political, and social performance. So we have to move from the kind of destabilizing finance that we saw in 2008 to productive and what I would call transitional finance, a kind of finance that enables us to make the green transition. Finance is particularly important because it helps shape the economy. Short-sighted finance plays an important role in encouraging short-sighted behavior. It played an important role in this lack of resilience that I talked about earlier, and the excessive risk-taking that marked the economies in the United States and many other countries before the 2008 crisis. Much of the growth of inequality has been associated with finance, and particularly with a lack of competition in the financial sector. One of the particular concerns that I have is the underinvestment in climate. These are long-term investments, and unfortunately, so far, have not been the center of attention of short-term financial markets. Now, the interesting thing here is that in terms of the investors, the savers, many of them are long-term, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds. The needs of our society are long-term, like climate change, infrastructure. But in between the long-term investors and the long-term investments sit short-term financial markets. And they have failed in their ability to intermediate between the two. A few years ago, the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board in the United States, Ben Bernanke, talked about a savings glut, that we had too much savings. When he said that, I sort of wondered, what planet did he live on? I looked around the world. I saw the needs for trillions of dollars of investment in climate and infrastructure, the needs in the developing countries and emerging markets. There was not a savings glut. The problem was the savings that was being created wasn't able to get to the investments that our global society needed. And that was the failure of the financial markets as they were then designed. And so the implication, the lesson that we should have taken out of that is that we need to change our financial markets. And that is what the ESG agenda is centrally about. How do we make our financial markets be better able to take the pools of savings and direct them where our society really needs these funds? So more concretely, what are some elements of the policy agenda that can help achieve this objective? Well, obviously, one element is changing the laws governing corporate governance to make sure that they don't mandate that financial institutions or corporations just focus on shareholder value, that they have to look at a broader set of concerns. In some countries, it is a fiduciary responsibility of pension funds or trustees for endowments just to look at short-term returns, stock market returns. But the wiser trustees understand that it is their fiduciary responsibility to look at the longer-term consequences. And those include the consequences for the environment and for our society. So that's one part, changing the legal frameworks for concerning corporate governance and those concerning the responsibility of fiduciaries. There's a second thing, which is disclosure, the laws governing what has to be disclosed. In the area of climate change, that's particularly important. There is both transitional risk and what's sometimes called physical risk. We can't allocate capital efficiently if we don't correctly assess risk. Investments in fossil fuels represent a high level of risk because almost surely there are at least a high probability that there will be stranded assets as eventually the world comes to understand the dangers associated with fossil fuels. Large parts of the United States, for instance, will be underwater and in other countries. And yet there has not been adequate disclosure of these climate risks, which are confronting various real estate properties. So good information, comparable information is absolutely essential for the efficient allocation of capital. And there's not going to be that disclosure without government mandates. Finally, we need regulation. In this area, central banks have played a critical role. There is systemic risk. We saw that in the 2008 crisis, where a mispricing of a small part of the assets of the world, subprime mortgages in the United States, led to a global financial crisis. Now we have a mispricing I believe, of a much larger set of assets. I talked about the real estate assets, the fossil fuel assets. We are at least experiencing a risk of a repricing of these significant amounts of assets. And when that occurs, and if that occurs, there can be large systemic effects. And it is the responsibility of central banks to assess the sustainability of our financial institutions and of our economy should that kind of systemic risk be realized. Most of the central banks have actually taken this on board, but I've been very disappointed that in the United States has been less willing to aggressively address this set of issues. Central banks also ought to traditionally have not taken on board risky assets. They've not accepted as collateral in the event of a bank has to be bailed out, there has to be a provision of liquidity. They've not taken on risky assets, they've only taken on prime assets. But they should make clear that fossil fuel assets, that kind of those loans made to risky, climate risky assets will not be acceptable. And that will, while it will have obviously allocation impacts, it will discourage these these dirty investments. They are part of the traditional mandate of central banks. Finally, I want to talk about institutional development. I mentioned before that private banks have, by and large, not done a good job of bringing together, intermediating between long-term investors and long-term investment projects. That was one of the reasons for the creation of development banks. And more recently, in many countries, including the United States, there have been a large number of green banks, green development banks created to help facilitate the flow of money into green finance. I think this is a welcome development. These green banks have been created at multiple levels, the level of communities, the level of the state, and I wish we had one at the level of the country as a whole, and there is some discussion going in that direction. But this is something that we need to encourage, and I think we ought to begin to think about creating a green development bank globally. Finally, one of the disappointments as I look at the problem of climate change is clearly a global problem. Unfortunately, many of the developing countries and emerging markets, while they want to help in the fight against climate change, have limited resources. The advanced countries promised $100 billion a year, but have not been able to come up with that money. But there is an interesting solution. Special drawing rights, a special kind of money that the IMF can and has created. Just this year, it issued $650 billion worth of SDRs in response to the pandemic. Vital help for the emerging markets and developing countries some of whom have been very badly hit by the pandemic. But the problem of climate change is not going to go away. It's going to be with us. And we need to address it, be able to address it year after year, both for mitigation and adaptation. And we have a tool, the emission the issuance of $200 billion of special drawing rights for climate change would enable these countries to play a more active role in fighting climate change and would make an enormous contribution to the global fight against climate change. So, in conclusion, finance has a very important role to play in addressing the problems of climate change and all the myriad of other problems our societies face today. But the financial institutions, as they've been in the past, have not been up to the task. They've been sort of part of the problem more than they've been part of the solution. They've continued to finance coal, they've continued to finance fossil fuels that will be with us well after we are supposed to be in net carbon neutrality in 2050. What I've tried to outline today is an agenda that takes ESG at its heart, but a policy agenda that enables this broader agenda to actually be implemented and thereby enable finance to play the positive role that it can play in creating the better society that we want to have. As we say in the United States, enabling us to build back better. So thank you for this opportunity to share with you some of my views on the important role that finance can play in addressing the climate crisis.